Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast. You guys know by now, David, co-host, we have a little bit of a different thing going on. We've got friends in the studio, whatever, Zoom room today. And so this is like real happy hour. I mean, this is like real conversations. And so we're going to find out what you guys are drinking. But I put something together before we all got on that's really interesting. And I want, David, you can lead with this after we figure out what we're drinking. But David is now writing letters to his son's former private Jewish school. We know Andrew Gutmann because his letter to the Brearley School went viral on what Barry Weiss's Substack. Then Paul Rossi is with us, and we know Paul because his letter also published by Barry as a teacher about how he's not going to indoctrinate his students. And then I'm actually working on a book of letters on how we talk about race. So we're like this weirdo band of misfit letter writers. Maybe that's how we all came together. So, okay. So what is each misfit drinking for this conversation?
Well, I just have Poland Spring here. I didn't know I was supposed to bring something a little harder to this event. No one told me that. You didn't put that in the email.
I mean, we kind of know each other.
Oh, my God.
I didn't know.
Never mind. All right. Paul.
I'm also drinking good old dihydrochloride monoxide in the WeWork aluminum stein.
I hate drinking out of metal. I don't know how you feel about that.
Branding. Yeah, you definitely get a little bit of an aftertaste with your water, but it's okay.
So you don't.
They should have plastic cups, but they, environmentally they switch to those.
Wait, would you not drink anything out of a can, Andrew? That's metal.
Yeah, that wouldn't be my choice. If I'm drinking water, I'd rather it out of not those metal cups.
My grandfather refused to drink out of any cans because he said he couldn't see what was inside. So he thought that they might put there might be like a dead mouse in there unless he could see it. So,
David, are you drinking
like razor blades in your Halloween candle? And
I'm drinking scotch today because this is my last meeting of the work week. I'm drinking.
Well, I'm drinking out of a can, and I'm drinking hard kombucha because I've decided if I'm going to drink alcohol, I might as well be healthy about it. So, yeah, hard kombucha out of a can.
Nice. Good for the gut flora.
Just so you know, I dispute the health benefits of it, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I don't know. Yeah. I'll let you know how I feel afterwards.
I can't even have coconut water.
Why?
It goes right through me. I don't know. There's something weird going on. I can't do it.
What if you put vodka in your coconut water?
I don't know. Maybe it would make it take care of that problem. I don't know.
I know you're here in Austin. They're all into like healthy drinks. And so, yes, you can get like healthy cocktails. So anyways, hey, David, so you have been on a letter writing campaign recently with your school. Tell us a little bit about how that's going.
So my kids went to a school. I'll mention it because it's a public letter. It's called the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School. It's a very good, pluralistic Jewish day school with a reputation for teaching critical thinking and high-level Jewish studies. I always felt that it was a very intellectually open place that encouraged my older son who graduated there to discuss and debate issues. I have to say I wasn't that surprised when somebody recently pointed out that they had embraced a DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice.
I thought you were going to say something with Judaism. That's why I was laughing.
Okay, no, it's justice, just plain old justice. And then I looked at it, and the framework sounded suspiciously similar to every other DEI initiative I've ever seen. Of examining the relationship between power and privilege and whatever. And then I looked at the student resources, and it's a list of websites and articles. And I started going through the websites and the articles, and literally there was not one single entry that could have been described as alternative or heterodox. Every single article reinforced the same point, and some of them, in rather extreme terms. So I decided to work with a colleague of mine who actually brought it to my attention. She's a wonderful woman, Black Jewish woman, named Brandy Shafatinsky. And she's an educator, PhD educator. We wrote a joint letter to the school saying we appreciate what the school has done for our children. And yet we were taken aback by this. And we would have given the school the benefit of the doubt, but the school did not have a single alternative reading assignment there. And we think that's unfortunate. That's what we said. Of course, I'm getting, called a racist and people are going ballistic, but there's a lot of people coming, as they usually do behind the scenes, messaging me, asking me for meetings, and we'll see where it goes. So that's where we are with it. But I did post it on a major Jewish education Facebook group with thousands and thousands of members, and it was taken down yesterday. It was not deemed worthy of a discussion within this Jewish educator community.
Who are the moderators for that? Do you know them?
I know a bunch of them because I was originally involved with setting up I was one of the early people in this Jewish educator site. So it's really, really despairing in a way to go through that, and to people call you a racist, and then other people agreeing, like they'll have like 20 likes on that one thing, and from people I know, and have known me for a long time, and they're liking the statement that says I'm a racist. I don't even know how to regard that. So anyway,
David, did anyone reach out to you privately?
There were a teacher from the school said, thank you. There's a whole group of us who have been talking behind the scenes, and he's not ready to come out publicly yet, but we are talking to him in the middle of next week, and we'll see where it goes. And several parents I've had meetings with him. So it's hard, but I'm thankfully I have great role models. Very early on in me taking the leap into this field, I read about this guy named Paul Rossi in Barry Weiss's Substack, who had exercised moral courage and intellectual courage. And then not too long afterwards, it must have been within a week or two, I read about this guy, Andrew Gutmann, who writes this letter. And I was inspired by both incidents, and I'm glad to have both of you as friends and colleagues and brothers in this major fight that we're all finding ourselves in to preserve the liberal operating system of our society. Paul, I don't know. Maybe we could start with Paul a little bit. Paul, and I'm by the way, sister, by the way, as well. I'm glad to have a sister in Jennifer Richmond, who's been my, one of my closest partners and making good trouble. Good trouble. Right. Yeah. So Paul, you went through this, and a lot of people have read about it. What's your life been? Maybe describe it very briefly. Give us the Reader's Digest version, and then describe how that it's affected your life since.
Sure. The short version is I had been a math teacher at a private school in Manhattan, Grace Church School, for 9 years, and in 2015 they shifted their mission statement and went to a full anti-racist mission, and then the DEI curriculum started to expand, and then I had been raising some red flags about what was going on among the student body, and in the curriculum I thought they were excesses, and I was basically ignored. And then February of this year, 2021, there was a racially segregated Zoom meeting with white identifying students and faculty in one room, and BIPOC identifying students and faculty in another Zoom room where they got substantially different content. I was in the white room, and they put up the white supremacy slide, which talks about the characteristics of white supremacy, including individualism and objectivity and all kinds of those terrible things. And I objected by, I didn't actually object directly. I wanted to set an example for the students, so that I knew there were students out there that had problems with this, and I wanted to model for them, how to that their teacher might also have problems with this, and how to ask questions about it. And when I started to do that, some of the students started to speak up, or started to ask questions and speak up and give different perspectives, and then the teacher started to ask questions, and at the end, then there were a series of for weeks afterwards, there was a series of segregated about and how a teacher like myself, how irresponsible it was for me to question the tenets of the anti-racist mission in the Zoom meeting, which really wasn't what I was doing. I'm committed to anti-racism, to genuine anti-racism. But the upshot of it was I was disciplined, and then I was subjected to a series of meetings, and there was a statement read to every student in the school about what I had done, and ultimately it got to be very strange and kind of ridiculous. And the breaking point for me was when a student came to me to offer private support, but he was nervous and scared that one of his more left-wing teachers would see him coming to me. So then I wrote an article for Barry Weiss's Substack, and that was very popular. And shortly after that, I was barred from the school building. My classes were taken away, and my contract expired. So here I am. And so since then, I've been doing a lot of thinking, reading, writing. I've been going to different conferences. I've been working with different organizations. I've learned so much about what's been going on, not just in New York, but nationally, among the private schools system, the public school system, how it's affecting, how this is affecting the culture more broadly, and trying to find ways to, I'm really kind of trying to focus on ways to push back, or effective methods of what they would call praxis, I suppose. What are some things that ordinary people can do in the situations they find themselves in that might make a difference or set an example? So that's what I've been really focused on.
So Andrew, tell us about what your story was and what it is.
Yeah. So my story was, my daughter was at a all girls, pretty prestigious K through 12 school in Manhattan called the Brearley School. And she had been there since kindergarten, and she was in 6th grade. And, we saw what we now call, for lack of a better term, the critical race theory or the social justice kind of creep into the curriculum, a tiny bit or a little bit, I should say, over the years, but nothing to the point where we would say, we're not going to keep her in this school. And then the 2 summers ago, with the events of George Floyd and BLM, it was like a light switch went off, and the mission of the school and a lot of these independent schools just changed overnight, from, teaching, from training intellectually courageous girls to training social justice warriors to training activists, a complete change of mission. And we knew that a lot of families like ours, and I say this then, I say, I still say this now, more than half of the families were very unhappy with the direction of the school. And we started to talk to them from the beginning of the school year in September, and we could not get other families to speak up. We had a lot of people say, I should send a letter, I should send an email. And this was COVID time, so parents were not allowed in the school. They're still not allowed in the school. Our school really went so far beyond a lot of the other independent schools, because we had to not only sign a community agreement or a pledge saying that we would support this not only within the school, but we would help teach these anti-racism principles at home. And we wound up refusing to sign that. And we had to take 2 mandatory anti-racism sessions for parents. So there was no excuse for parents not knowing what was going on. Different than in a lot of other schools where parents, maybe only heard about this by overhearing their kids on Zoom school. There was no excuse for Brearley parents not to know what they were teaching, at least to some extent, because we had to take these mandatory sessions for parents. And, we said, okay, at some point we've got to get other parents to speak up. They've got to speak up. They know this is wrong. They know this is damaging their kids' education. They know this is destroying the school. And to our knowledge, nobody did. And so we decided not to re-enroll our daughter for the next school year. And that was a joint decision, myself, my wife, and my daughter. And if my daughter had wanted to stay in the school, we would have absolutely let her, and we would have just tried to fight this quietly within the school. But she knew that she wasn't getting the education that we wanted, that she wanted, that we had signed up for. So she was supportive. And at that point, I said, okay, I'm going to do something. And I felt it was not professionally cancelable, so I wasn't worried about losing my job. And I thought, somebody had to do something. So I wrote a letter that I mailed to every family in the school, which was 656 families. I think the only 3 I didn't send to were 3 that had overseas addresses. And it unexpectedly went viral. I never really thought it would be read by anybody other than these Brearley families. I thought maybe it gets picked up in the sort of New York City gossipy press that likes to talk about these very expensive private schools. But I never expected it to go viral. And Barry Weiss found me, actually. I was on the phone. I mailed a letter on a Wednesday. Friday afternoon, I started to get calls from parents. I think around 1 o'clock, I got a call. Then I got another call from a parent of our grade. And then I had this email from Barry saying, text me, email me, you've got to contact me. I'm posting this, And so the next few days were sort of a blur. I think the next about 5 days. And then the first event I did, and I said no. I had, every show on Fox wanted me on. I think, Paul probably had the same experience. But sort of, I decided not to do any media for the first week or two. But the first event I did was one with Paul. In fact, this is the first event we've done together since, really, which was Barry Weiss's, I think, first live stream event that she had ever had.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Was that your first event? Was that your first?
The first thing I was on was the Clubhouse. That was I think it was the night it came. My article came out, or the night after that, and I was completely fried.
Okay.
I can't remember what I was saying.
Yeah,
I remember. You sounded coherent.
That's good.
So yeah,
I get this email from Barry after that event. She's like, "You need to eat more." This is Barry being like the Jewish mom, right? You got to eat more. I look too thin. I guess people told her that I look too thin on this, but we didn't sleep or eat for like the first 5 days. I think that event was about 5 days after my letter, something like that. So that sort of changed my life.
Sure. So I have this sense that your critique of this is not just, teaching of a view you disagree with on disparity or race or racism, but there's a larger critique about that it's somehow corruptive of education in a broader way. Am I wrong about that? And if what is your take on that? That, like, Andrew, you took your daughter out of the school and she wasn't learning anything anymore. Was it just about what you didn't want her to learn, or how did it corrupt the larger educational process in your view?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's what she was learning and what she was not learning. They incorporated, again, what they call their anti-racism initiatives, what broadly we now call sort of CRT, into every aspect of the curriculum. Not just with these special DEI seminars, not just in English and history, but they incorporated this into art and music and science and math. And so there's a number of things. There's sort of the gutting of the English literature and history curriculum. And to me, that's really, really important. I'm a big believer in sort of classical education, and that every kid should get some of that. History, especially history and civics, I think is something that we do horrifically in schools, private and public, even before this whole sort of CRT issue. And now it's even that much worse. But that this was incorporated, into everything. I think so. There's this ideology that I do not think kids should be taught. And then there's what is not being taught. Again, the history, the civics. I think there were 5 books in the 6th grade English class that they had historically always taught, and I think they kept one of them last year, which was, I forget what it was, the Iliad or the Odyssey, I think. But the other 4, I think one was Shakespeare, one might have been Dickens, I don't remember. They got it for what is now the identity politics or social justice kind of books. But I think broadly speaking, I've said this a lot, which is my letter was criticized, called a racist, all those things. But to me, it was never about race. It was about the inability, the unwillingness of these schools to have discussions on these issues. And it was about the indoctrination. And I know I get pushback on that a lot. I know a lot of us in this movement sort of get pushback when we use the word indoctrination. That's too strong, but it really was. And again, to the sense that we as parents had to sign a pledge that we would teach this in the home. I mean, to me, that's, as much indoctrination as anything could be. They teach Singapore math. We don't have to sign a pledge supporting that. They teach the theory of evolution. We don't have to sign a pledge supporting that. They taught Mandarin, to all the kids. We don't have to sign a pledge supporting that. So I think that was much more than just the specific CRT stuff. Was that, they changed the mission, and that I think they really are indoctrinating these kids, that there isn't the ability, the comfort to be able to speak freely in the classroom, both teachers and students. They can't ask the questions. They have to, adhere to this ideology. And it goes, I say this, it goes really beyond that. Not only do they have to be anti-racist, right? If you're not an anti-racist, you're a racist. But even to be an anti-racist is not enough. You have to be an activist. If you're not an activist, you are a racist. I mean, that's as far as they went. So I think it's all these things together.
Well, what's worse is, in addition to being called racist, a lot of us now have been lumped into the domestic terrorist category as well. So we've got that. And that goes to something, David, you were talking about the National Association of School Boards letter to Merrick Garland, and that they were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that they were saying that no one's really teaching racism, that only 8%,
only 8% of teachers say that they're teaching
CRT. Right. And then, but that goes to what Andrew is saying. It's not teaching CRT, right? It's not actually having a class called CRT or ethnic studies. It's the fact that it's like infiltrated into all the ways that we teach. I mean, Paul, you were a teacher. How did you see that play out with you in, on the ground?
Well, I think, just to speak to that about the CRT and the claim that it's not CRT. I mean, it really is a very narrow objection about the particular focus on CRT. What's actually happening? There are two things that are happening. One is that there are CRT derived theories that are broadly from that trunk and branches off that trunk, like critical whiteness studies is one, critical gender studies. So these are things that incorporate some of those, those foundational insights from the 70s. And then the second thing is that an important part of this is praxis. So there's no, from the foundational texts, critical race theory and introduction, Delgado, Stefanchik, all these things, they're always talking about praxis. So what is praxis? Well, praxis is going out into the field, taking over these educational institutions, and then indoctrinating the kids into becoming, better people according to the theory. So that's, they may not be teaching the content particularly. They finesse it in two ways. One is that they're not teaching the specific content that they teach in law schools. And then the second thing is that, it's what's more important is the praxis. So when you actually, every time you move down a level from, the academic work to the conferences, to the teacher trainings, to the student trainings, to the poor schlubby teacher in the classroom who gets handed a slide deck, and then they're going to put that in front of the kids, and then the kids themselves, you have this sort of degradation of nuance and academies and it gets sort of rendered into this basically the racism of these teachings is readily apparent in that they create a moral imperative and a moral schism between the races as to who's an oppressor, who's the oppressed, who's good, who's bad, and the kids interpret this in terms of moral primary colors. So what really bothered me the most after that long preamble is the psychological impact of the students' self-concept. And so they started in ninth grade with these DEI interventions. The curriculum focused around how the student sees themselves, and the most salient feature of their identity is their race. So if you are Jewish, Italian, Scandinavian, even Persian, you're not you're not your ethnicity, your nationality. You are those things, but really, what matters in the context of American society is your race, your whiteness, and having that gives you a certain set of assumed privileges for which you should try to, you're given a sort of set of a marching orders on how you're supposed to behave as an ally, like you mentioned, Jennifer, and how you may, or even perhaps a co-conspirator or an accomplice. And so they have this whole language, strangely around war and crime that the students interpolate or interject into themselves this sense of their own culpability, responsibility. It doesn't matter their provenance or their ancestry. What matters is this anticipation that because they're seen a certain way, or they're told that they're seen a certain way, that this and on the for Black students, that means that it's very important that you introject this Black identity. People, these are culturally real things, even if they may not be biologically real. But what they were being taught was that there is a way to be politically Black. There's a solidarity. There's an authentic identity, a way to be a certain thing. That if you don't align with that, well, then you're not really, you're not really getting it. And so there would be a lot of pressure both within the classroom, I think, and outside the classroom to join affinity groups, to have the students align their views with what the school believed their race meant that they should think, and this was really debilitating. I saw to some Black students that were starting to really look upon the school itself, and they would talk about the importance of going to a school where people look like them. And I think this is there's some truth to this. It is difficult. There are cultural differences, but that is a extremely parochial, provincial way of these schools are supposed to open you up to different things and ideas and give you opportunities to see other points of view. And what was happening was that the students were becoming really looking for themselves in this way that was kind of denying them the opportunities that being in these schools was supposed to offer. And so it was limiting. I felt it was extremely limiting to their sense of possibility.
Did you also see? I mean, was this also for you the George Floyd BLM summer that this little shift, or was this at Grace Church? Was this going on much before that?
This was happening before, but it definitely accelerated with the George Floyd and George Floyd murder, and the response of the administration there, during that time, was kind of staggered me and really shocked me a little bit. There was a letter that I believe 7 or 9 Black students sent to the administration. They called for the canceling of classes, which were at the end of the term, canceling of all tests, because they had been subjected to so-called white opinions around the events of George Floyd, and that this was causing exhaustion. And I can imagine it being difficult, but no one could ever answer my question about what a white opinion was. What does it mean to have a white opinion? And what does that mean that we're starting to take that for granted, like that is something and that should justify something? So that was frightening to me, and that made me really think about the whole thing going off the rails. And we're entering in sort of like witch hunt territory here.
Yeah, one of the shocking things about this discourse is how almost infinitely malleable it seems to me. Like there's almost as if there's some central authority who sort of sends out the talking points to everybody in the woke movement and says, okay, here's what we're going to say now. So the latest, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this, the latest wrinkle is in this northern Texas school district, I think called South Lake, Texas. Yesterday, some ridiculous administrator who's anti-CRT said that that the school should now has to teach opposing views on the Holocaust because we believe that we should teach opposing views on racism. And of course, that's ridiculous. But now I'm getting all kinds of inquiry about, well, am I not just going down a slippery slope? Once you say we should have opposing views on structural racism, aren't we saying that we can have opposing views on the Holocaust? What would you say to that? You were both been enmeshed in this, and same with you, Jennifer. What would you say to that so-called logic?
I don't know the exact legislation in Texas that I think prompted that. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I have it here somewhere, but yeah, it's
No, I mean there's a
House Bill
limit. I mean this is
3979, right?
there's I have a lot of our side of this issue, and Paul and I were just at a conference up in Boston called the Diversity of Thought in K through 12 Education, and a lot of us are saying what's the flip side of this? It's diversity of thought, and to some extent that's right. But clearly there is a limit, right? To your point, there's a limit on you don't always want to have two sides of everything, and even on the issue of indoctrination. I mean, I sort of think about this. I've been meaning to write about this. To some extent, all education is indoctrination, right? There's indoctrination, there's inculcation, there's just education, but it's all to some extent a line of the same thing. And look, I want kids that have good values, right? I mean, you want kids to be able to ask questions and feel free to ask questions, and even if they're silly, even if they're sometimes inappropriate. But schools do have a responsibility for teaching certain things, and one of the things I think we should be teaching is sort of classical liberal values, Enlightenment values, America's founding principle values. That doesn't mean you don't introduce Karl Marx to something, but it does mean that you say, okay, these are the reason we can have free speech in this country is because we have these certain principles. The reason we have a prosperous society is because we have these capitalist free market principles. At least we used to, not Marxist. So this is a tricky question of how far do you go? You need free speech in the classroom, clearly, but I think there is responsibility for schools to teach in many things the right thing, and we do teach 2 + 2 = 4. Someone can ask why that is, but it isn't just as valid to say no, that's not correct, because that is correct. So
Right.
I don't know if I answered the question.
And the fact that there are edge cases in gray areas doesn't negate the principle of a free expression of ideas, right? Like,
That's right.
we can understand that at certain times it gets really hard to decide whether something crosses into sort of crosses any red lines. But in a society that values free speech, we're going to err on the side of free speech, and
That's right.
more than we are going to err on the side of trying to rein somebody in.
But I think I think
Is that
this
right?
gets to the issue of this ban CRT legislation, which I know is somewhat controversial, even amongst the anti-CRT people. Is, do you go down this slippery slope of actually doing more harm than good? And I've seen some of these debates. I mean, I am a proponent of, in public schools where free speech issues are somewhat different. These are government schools. These are government employees. They don't have, the kids might have the free speech. The teachers, being government employees, don't necessarily have the same, constitutional protections. I am a fan of banning it, but it's tricky, because if you go too far one way or another, you may do more harm than good. So I think you've got to be, those legislators that are looking at this have to be very careful with that. And I do kind of see both sides of that issue.
Yeah, Paul, what about you?
Yeah, with the do you teach, can we teach alternative views on the Holocaust? Say, I think that's a really interesting, it's a very interesting way to try to, shift the debate. And it reminds me actually of the creationists, who would talk about, what was it called, design, or this different alternate theory of the beginning of the universe, and why can't we give that equal time in physics, for example? And so I think at that point, one of the things that helped me think about those questions was Jonathan Rush's book, Kindly Inquisitors. One of the
Yes.
first, I think that come out
It's
as
a
early as the
great book.
90s. What
Yes.
a prescient book. And
Yeah.
he talks about liberal science being the, where you would maybe draw the line. And so, it's very clear that with something like the Holocaust, there's evidence, right? We have clear, strong evidence that this thing occurred, and you have historians that poured over this, for they're eyewitnesses. And so you can really say very clearly, like, no, for the same reason that we don't believe, the moon is made of green cheese, we're going to teach, that the Holocaust happened. This is not the same kind of thing. If you're talking about a theory, really a religion in itself, which is what the way I see, and many others see, critical race theory derived praxis in schools, where there's a certain moral imperative, and what it means to be a good person, a push to activism, and a whole belief structure. Like, those are not objective realities, even though they may think they are. They're not objective realities that aren't subject to debate. So I look at those two things very differently. I find it interesting that someone would try to make those things the same.
Yeah, and I lean towards, I think, what Andrew said. I mean, 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, the Holocaust is, CRT well, I guess it's what both of y'all said. I mean, CRT is a theory and, not a truth.
But
it's a belief that's being represented as knowledge, is the way I would put it. And that is wrong. That, I mean, if I could continue to the point of should it be banned in schools? I agree with Andrew for the most part, and I think that's even more true for if you're talking about kindergarten through 8th grade. You really need to have a single moral framework for children that are below a certain age, and that should really be set by the community. I think the community should have some say in exactly what that is and what the Overton window of education is there, because I don't know how you could teach, two incommensurate moral systems to, children. That could lead to some serious chaos. When you get to like 9th or 10th or 11th, you could maybe start to bring in, okay, some people say this about, the Constitution. Some people say this. And so I know there are curricula out there that present differing sides of an issue and different theories, and then the students can make up their own minds. But certainly in higher education, I would say, yeah, I mean, I think where the problem gets in when you try to ban specific content, like the 1619 Project, as opposed to banning a divisive practice. So if you ban, if you say you can't teach this thing, I think it's actually silly to expect that it'll work, because any teacher worth their salt can get around it by just telling the kids, I'm not allowed to teach you this. And you can ask me any question you want about it as long as it comes from you. I mean, that's just like setting the whole thing up to collapse. And you're going to get a serious Streisand effect with that. But if you say, you can't expressly try to make one racial group feel, worse than another, that may happen as a consequence of teaching some, if you teach about slavery, then maybe some people feel bad. But if you expressly try to do things that make one, which was happening at my school and at other schools, to make one group responsible, basically blood guilt, ancestral guilt, even when their ancestors may have nothing to do with something, then that's bad.
There are violations of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? There are things like, and I think that, the idea of a privilege, what is it called? The privilege stack, where people have to sort themselves out based on where they fit into the hierarchy of privilege, and then are either empowered to speak or prevented from speaking, depending on where they fall into that matrix. To me, that's a violation of their civil rights. So I have no problem using that to, if the school crosses the line there, so I guess it depends on what you're talking about when you say teach CRT in school. I guess I haven't figured out what that means yet. In some ways, I feel like both the right and the left, if you will, I'm not sure those are good descriptions, are sort of both in their own way misrepresenting what CRT is. To me, CRT is sort of a framework that starts with a systems level analysis of society and says racism is embedded in systems, and yes, of course, you could the left says no, that's not what it is. It's really just a legal framework, but that's not true. I mean, the entire idea of CRT is sort of infiltrated in various academic areas and eventually became sort of intellectually dominant. And I think the right side portrays it as as sort of not everybody on the right, obviously, is teaching about slavery or history or anything that might not perfectly be in line with a purist notion of what American history is. Again, I mean, it seems to me what we want our schools to do is is expose kids to different ideas. That doesn't mean, and going back to what Andrew said, of course, there's going to be sort of a thread that runs through it about what American history is, and I guess you can't completely obliterate that historical narrative, nor should you want to, but at the same time, you could I wouldn't, even if we teach our kids, America, about American idealism and what it means to be American, and make that the dominant narrative, I still would want them to be able to, read Howard Zinn or somebody like that and say, okay, well, I disagree with that, and have the freedom to do so. And I think under this current regime, they're not allowed.
No, I think, look, there are questions, and I don't know the answer to them. Is, should public schools be patriotic? For the betterment of our country and democracy. I mean, I think that's a valid argument. Obviously, that's a conservative view, and I'm not sure where I fall out on that. You talk about Howard Zinn. I mean, I think almost every school now in public school has adopted sort of the Howard Zinnification of history curriculum, which is he is a very Marxist basis for this curriculum. Now, again, you get to what Paul said in high school or in college. Should that be something where you can compare different, ways of looking at history? Sure. In K through 8. No, I don't think so. I mean, a lot, to go broader on this, I mean, so much of this whole, again, well, for lack of a better term, CRT, which is not just race, it's the gender stuff, it's the trans stuff, it's sexuality. So much of this is age inappropriate, and that's part of it too. I do think I'll push back slightly on what you said, David, which is, sure, there's some misrepresentation on both sides. I think the left is misrepresenting this far, far, far more than the right. I mean, the criticism that all of us get is, oh, you just want to tell your kid, no, you shouldn't learn slavery and Jim Crow. I mean, there's not a single person in this movement that says, don't teach slavery, don't teach Jim Crow, don't teach, the Trail of Tears, what we did to the Native Americans. I mean, that's just an absurd, view to have. But that is what a lot of us, hear in response to what we're doing.
Yeah, I would add, I felt the same way. And I think what we need is to find a way to teach a sane, the warts and all. So you have the warts, but you also have a sense of common identity, e pluribus unum. I mean, that's what it's all about within the United States. I mean, one of the functions of private school, I believe from its inception, was to create a common culture. And, what I think is what we're seeing in schools is really just the end of a process and a particular impetus to take over the institutions by, I'll just say it, Marxism. I mean, it is identity Marxism in a way. So you're just, what we're seeing is really just as part of the elephant here, or the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole thing that's been going on in the culture for decades, and I think we need to name it. We need to call it for what it is. I mean, they're trying to people have a great incentive. I'm not sure exactly why, but a serious incentive to divide our culture and to exacerbate the contradictions and accelerate the contradictions, to rebuild, to destroy and rebuild back better. I mean, that's and what does that mean? Well, the experts will tell you what that means.
Yeah, Paul,
but that's a great point. I mean, this is so divisive. Even if it's well-meaning, which I don't think it is. I mean, you go back to affirmative action, even if that, that was probably well-meaning and counterproductive, I think, in my view. This is so counterproductive. I mean, this leads to more segregation. This leads to enormous divisiveness. I mean, I think this ultimately tears the country apart if we don't reverse these trends.
But don't you think, Andrew, I want to push back on that a little bit, that okay, listen, the core people who are involved with this, who want to sort of tear down the Western whiteness matrix, I get. I don't consider that well-meaning, even if they think they're trying to make society better. But don't you think that there are a lot of sort of soft woke people out there who really haven't thought about this too much? They might not have the strongest critical thinking skills in the world, and they're hearing about this, and it sounds to them very much like every other civil rights exhortation that they've ever gotten, and they say, okay, well, if that, if I'm going to help, alleviate disparity or make the world better, then I'm in. I mean, can we extend them the principle of charity in that, or no?
Well, to some extent, sure. To another, but it doesn't matter, because this very woke progressive whatever the number is, 10% of America, give or take, has really taken over everything. And it's certainly taken over the left to the point where it's, the whole cancel culture issue, right? It's cowered everybody else into silence. So I do fault people for not pushing back on that. I think the level of cowardice in this country is just off the charts. Yes, we know not everybody is these hardcore woke CRT people, but they have managed, to basically take over so much of America. The federal government, the military, corporate America, clearly universities, K through 12 schools, and so I mean, we can.
By the way.
What's that?
It's a very impressive endeavor in a way. I have to
It
say,
is.
like
if
you think about how did 10% actually become so culturally dominant?
It's terrifying. It's impressive and terrifying. I mean, we all say the same thing. Now we, and a lot, you see the same thing on kind of COVID stuff, which is obviously even in a lot of ways even more controversial. But I think a lot of us have said this. Now we kind of understand how Nazi Germany happened. That you can, whether it's brainwash people, and I think in the COVID side that's very true, or just cower people into silence. Again, I'll say what I said earlier. More than half of the families at Brearley, and I believe more than half of the board of trustees at Brearley, were on, our side, my side of the letter, even if they didn't necessarily agree with every single thing I wrote. And yet almost, publicly, nobody else speak up. Publicly, the board of trustees voted unanimously to, continue, really double down on Brearley's anti-racism initiatives. And so this cowardice issue is just unbelievable. And that's what this, small minority of very woke progressives have managed to do to our country. We have to push back on this. Some of us have to fight.
I want to hear what your theory of cowardice is. Why?
Yeah,
I want you to answer that question. Why are people so cowardly?
Well, I think there's a broader societal issue, and then there's the people in schools. The people in schools. I mean, obviously they're worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about getting their kids kicked out of school, losing their social circles. If they're a board of trustees. And I found like the richer, these billionaire hedge fund people are the most scared to kind of speak up because they're worried about getting kicked off of all the other things, and they feel like they have the furthest to fall. I think broadly speaking, though, the center left, which may not agree with what's going on, may understand that these CRT practices, these very woke practices, are very damaging to our schools and our country. They are terrified of two things. They're terrified of being called racist, because that has become sort of the biggest slur that you can be called in this country, and they're terrified of being called conservatives. Which is, and the two of those things has made it almost impossible for those people to speak up. That's my view.
I like what you said about. Sorry.
No, go, Paul.
I like, David. It is really important to maintain a principle of charity here, and we can disagree with people's ideas or maybe the effects of their ideas, but I had great relations. Maybe not the best relations, but I had pretty good relations with my colleagues, even though I disagreed with them. I knew them to be good people, even if they were so-called true believers. And I found that they had a certain vision of the good society, and that's really what they're aiming at. When I really think about the mindset that my colleagues had, it was that reality is corrupt, and we are trying to head for this utopia or dream state, right? Where and the only way to get there is if we start tinkering with things and equity, and we, basically reverse racism or try compensatory racism, and all the things that they do that seem so unjust to myself and other people are really done to try to manipulate into being this dream, this future utopia, right? And so, if you tell them, this has been tried before, how'd that work out for you? And they'll say, well, that was because it's so easy for them to say, oh, they made all these mistakes in the past, and this really because of whiteness or whatever, that it didn't work out, but there's the number of justifications are there, and you can say, well, what makes you think that you're any different? But they, so they aggregate into themselves the power, and the moral clarity that apparently no one in the past had. But really what they're aiming for is a kind of vision of the good society, right? So, my vision of the good society is right now, if everyone acts according to their conscience, what Andrew calls courage, if people live with moral courage, and stand up for people without an end goal in mind, so that you don't have these silly contradictory political stances, that don't seem to make any sense. Like, well, if our COVID mandates are actually very racist by Kendi's definition, why should we? So, so I just think that we're dealing with very deeply incommensurate worldviews, but we are still dealing with good people. So we do have to remember that, and we have to be patient with each other, and to elicit these deep differences, even at the level of identity. What does it mean to be existentially, right? Their view is that society makes us who we are. How we are seen is introjected into how we see ourselves as early as 6 months, and there's structural determinism to that. Like, we don't have the ability to define ourselves. I happen to disagree with that view. I think that we have a conscience. We are, divine beings that have the ability to transcend our environment. They form us to some degree, but we can make choices that overcome our programming. They tend not to believe that's a thing. They tend to think that's a fanciful idea. And I think, this is if we're going to actually get to know each other, that's one of the foundational differences that we have.
I want to touch on two things that both of you said. I mean, Andrew asked about should we teach, should public schools be patriotic? And I don't know that they should be. I mean, I think classical education doesn't necessarily have to be patriotic. However, my concern is this is so much more than critical race theory. This is what you touched on, Paul. I mean, this is about teaching kind of Marxist theory, oftentimes wrapped in racial paradigms, but not always. And that's what I don't think we should teach either way. We shouldn't teach Marxist, and we don't need to have people drumming in patriotism either. But I don't know that there's this middle ground.
Well, I think there's, the opposite. Sorry, the opposite of Marxist is not necessarily patriotic. It's more free market capitalist. And I think we should be teaching that now. What we have, and this goes way on this, what we want to talk about here. I think what we have today is nothing anywhere near a free market or capitalist society. And that's one of the problems. It's so easy to attack what's going on today. We have enormous income inequality. That's something that I've written a lot about, which is not a conservative right issue. My reasons for why that has happened is different from most people's. But we do have an economy that I think that fundamentally doesn't work. But from the theoretical perspective, free markets or capitalist society is what has brought the world to prosperity, certainly not Marxism. So I do think, you teach what Marxism is. You need to, because it has had such an important impact on history, in the last, 100 or so years. But I do think you teach, this is why we have prosperity. This is why we have freedom. These are these values. Now, do you teach America is great and America has never done wrong? No, I don't think you teach that. But I do think what you should teach is that, we were the only country in the world that was founded on values, on principles, and these specific Enlightenment type principles. I do think that, and we should, I think, as Americans, be proud of that. I mean, we are still the country that everybody else wants to come to. Right? We so many people say this. Well, if our country is so terrible, if we are so racist, why is all these, people from around the world dying to come here, right? For freedom, for economic opportunity. And I do think that, we should be proud of that. And I do think that that is a message that schools, certainly public schools, should come across. And I think to go further, what all schools now are doing, it's not just not teaching that. They are actively teaching children to hate our own country and to hate our history. I don't think society, we don't survive that if that goes on for very long.
Now, let me push back on this idea that what we're being taught, what our kids are being taught, is Marxist. It's certainly related to Marxist, right? But they sort of substituted economic culture for economics. And there are a lot of Marxists, by the way, who despise this. There are socialists who really do not like this at all. They would prefer sort of a liberal operating system, but a socialist economy. So I personally don't like calling it Marxist, even though it grew out of a originally a Marxist framework because mostly, number one, most traditional Marxists despise it and don't think it's correct. Some of those people who are maybe I'm not talking about the hardcore Marxists, but some of them may even be allies in trying to protect our sort of social operating system, and I'm not sure why that's the best way of describing it, considering that like when you talk about culture in that sense, it's really not the same as economics. It obviously there's similarities, but just because two things are similar doesn't make them the same. So that's my pushback against sort of using the Marxist moniker in the current moment.
Well, would you
But
think it would be okay to then say cultural Marxism? Does that fit more what you're?
I don't know that it gets you what you want. Like I'd rather just describe what it is. In other words,
Yeah.
what is it? It's this. It's got, in my view, it's got two core components. One is that racism and oppression are embedded in the very systems of society, and two, that only the people who are adversely affected by it have the moral standing and the lived experience to define it for the rest of us. I mean, there's more to it than that. That's a simplification, of course. But when you have those basic two precepts, the first is now sort of canonized by the second, right? If people can say, well, listen, I'm the only one that gets to define this for society, so you have to listen to me, and that's exactly what they say. It's a demand for deferring to their take on society. I don't, is that Marxist? What Marxism really never made those sort of, I hate this word, but epistemological claims. They didn't say you have to think this because I think it. They might say I'm going to go to war with you over it because I think you're trying to hold us down.
I mean, this might be
yeah,
too.
no, that's a valid. I mean, that is a very valid criticism there.
I mean, and this might be too simplistic of the way of thinking about Marxism, and I'll give you that. I mean, I think we should think. I mean, we are all proponents of critical thinking, but a lot of the frameworks that I see is this activism, right? So they're trying to activate. It's not education; it's activism that leads to, like what Paul said, joy, happiness, quote, utopia. That's a Marxist playbook. I mean, that we teach activism that leads to a utopia. It
is a utopianism. It's a brand of utopianism, no doubt. But that's not what makes Marxist. That's not its distinct characteristic.
Can I step in for a little bit, David? So what people have said. I just got back from a 3-day seminar with James Lindsay of New Discourses. He's a real thought leader in this arena.
Well. I do.
Yeah, and so the way he would describe it, and I think it's accurate, the way he sort of draws the line, if I can be so bold as to try to characterize it, is that there's Marx 1.0, which is Marx himself, noting the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy and watching history unfold according to certain laws. Then you have Leninism, which is sort of Marxism 2.0, where you have a vanguard, and you have praxis and state Marxism and so on. And then, when that failed and collapsed, you have cultural Marxism, which you identified Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno. And what they realized was, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem because the middle class, is actually prosperous. And so because people are happy, they've hijacked, the contradictions of history. So we have to find a way to make people unhappy. And so, broadly, that's basically what happened. And Marcuse himself wanted to create people who were maladapted to society in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so that they would accelerate the contradictions within society. And so he looked towards what he called, the ghetto peoples, the black underclass, or white upscale liberals. He wanted to activate those and sort of push those grievances to a point where they could undermine society. And today, with wokeness from Crenshaw and CRT, we have sort of Marxism 4.0, which is called, Lindsay calls it identity Marxism, where you actually locate the sources of power according to these power blocks. And it's no longer, just about, it's completely divorced from the bourgeoisie and proletariat at this point. So someone, like you mentioned, Big Adolf Reed Jr., a lot of these thinkers they see all of this Marxism 4.0 as sort of a bourgeois thing. So it's a fascinating sequence over the last 150 years that has led us to where we are. But so it combines the long march of the institutions through cultural Marxism with this new strain, which is coined as identity Marxism. So I really do believe that's what's going on here from Crenshaw. The idea of a universal humanity where I am a person who is black to I am black. So it is a total reframing, of recolonization of what it means of identity itself. And upon that, they layer diversity, inclusion, equity, all according to the framework of redistributing resources to these different groups.
Yeah.
Can I say 30 seconds?
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, two things really quick. One is I think we should take the allies where we can get them. So yes, I agree we should be careful who we criticize here, but I'll say, socialism is not compatible with freedom. And anybody believes in both is a little bit confused.
Yeah, well, maybe. But right now, I'll fight that fight later. It's like, one of the things I'm fascinated by is how the new atheists made up with the religionists in the past several months. Peter Boghossian has actually written about this. He was the original new atheist on all the podcasts railing against belief in God. And then, of course, the woke controversy came and it split apart the new atheist community. And now he's best of friends with some of the religious folks who are opposed to it. And the argument's over. Right, the argument between him and the religions is over right now because you got bigger fish to fry. Right now, we're just trying to protect liberal democracy and the liberal operating system. So whether you're right about that, look, for many, many years, many of us who regard ourselves as sort of a capitalist thought that as soon as China liberated its economy, its politics would be liberated as well, because there was an inextricable link between free markets and freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. And it turned out not really to be the case, at least in China. I know we have a China expert here too. So I'm not saying that I do believe ultimately capitalism is more about just free trade and the ability of people to exchange goods. It's also about freedom, and it's inculcating freedom. But I think it is complicated, and I'm very grateful to work with socialists on trying to preserve the liberal society.
Me too. I would work with a hardcore Marxist to do that. So I may slag on Marxism, but it doesn't mean I won't work with them. It kind of reminds me of the Lord of the Rings. When they're all deciding to go return the ring to Mount Doom, and there's Legolas and there's Gimli, and they say, did you ever think you'd fight side by side with a dwarf? And then he says, "Oh, how about with a friend?" So that's a nice way of looking at it.
Ah, that's nice. Emily's my favorite. I like it. Okay,
look,
well,
we need as many allies in this fight.
We do,
as we can get.
But I thought that was really interesting, the Marxism, the identity part of it, because maybe traditional Marxists don't buy into this new Marxism 4.0, but there is a crossover there.
Yeah, it's using like identity blocks, the contradictions between them, and accelerating those contradictions to take apart their focus is really about taking things apart, because in sort of a Rousseauian notion of the divine, the good nature of humankind will somehow make a better world on its own. If you tear everything up, then it'll make things beautiful and wonderful and glorious. And it's funny because I had a long conversation with one of the DEI people at my school when I was in the middle of all my troubles, and she, after a long conversation and listening to it, she really did admit that what she wanted was equality of outcome. I mean, she said, yeah, we want equality of outcome. That's what we want. And I was like, thank you for just making that plain. And we can disagree about that, and I respect your right to believe that, but I will fight that. But we can talk. It doesn't mean we can't talk. Mm-hmm. As long as we're talking, we're not doing anything. We're not doing something worse.
That's the problem with cutting off talking, which is what we have today.
Well,
We can't have these conversations.
No.
I mean, we can. And that's part of the problem. I mean, especially about issues like race. It's just become this complete taboo to have, and I wrote this in my letter, which is, I call bullshit on the fact that they kept saying over and over that we want you to have the difficult conversations about race. No, they don't.
Right.
They want to have very, very superficial conversations about race. I mean, when we had to do these training for parents, it was these role playing. If you saw your daughter, sing along to some rap song that had the N-word, what would you do? Those are not the deep conversations about race. You want to talk about why, Black girls are underrepresented at Brearley? Fine, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. But that is not at all what they want to talk about.
Courageous conversations.
So speaking of, thank you guys we have to do this again, even if we're not recording. We need to
next time I'll get something stronger than Poland Spring.
We have to have our happy hours
Yeah.
together.
Be nice to do this in person. It really would.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.